Is Ireland's farmland better than other EU countries? And should our agricultural targets differ because of that?
That's a very interesting one. Our
These
emissions
aren't
from
really rapid fire questions, are they?
That's a deep one.
maybe give that one again.
Do you want me to read it out again, or do you need to have more time? Welcome back to the Science Week podcast with Science Foundation Ireland. I'm Anne-Marie Tomchak, and today is the first day of Science Week 2022. All week, there's going to be a national celebration of science in our day-to-day lives, with hundreds of events taking place across Ireland. And for the first time since 2019, events are happening in person. On this episode, we're going to be discussing the award-winning Dingle Peninsula 2030 project. For those who don't know about it, the aim of this project is to create a sustainable future for the Dingle Peninsula as they attempt to transition the area to a low-carbon society, something that the entire planet is grappling with right now. And in just the past few weeks, the SFI MaREI Research Centre picked up a number of awards, including one for its Dingle Peninsula 2030 partnership for Best Energy Community. Congratulations to them on that. And I'm delighted to welcome onto the show Professor Brian Ó Gallachóir, Director of the MaREI Research Centre, and Clare Watson, a researcher there with a focus on community engagement. Brian and Clare, thank you so much for joining us today on the Science Week podcast. Brian, can I start with you? And I'm going to start with a really simple question. Why Dingle?
Why Dingle? Well, it's a great question. There's a number of reasons. I suppose the community down there wanted to explore what a low energy future might look like. At the same time, the Dingle Peninsula is in a very isolated area from the perspective of the electricity network. And so that made it very interesting for our industry partner, ESB Networks, as a place where you could test out what does electrification of heat and transport look like in a rural area. And essentially, the electrification of heat and transport is part of the energy transition to a low carbon future, where instead of burning fossil fuels in our car engines and in our homes and buildings, we're using electricity, and that electricity coming from renewable sources. So this would involve things like having heat pumps in our homes and buildings and using electric vehicles for transport. And what that would normally mean then is an increase in electricity usage. And the traditional way to accommodate an increase in electricity usage is to build new power lines. But the Dingle Peninsula, as well as being an isolated part of the electricity network, it's also a very beautiful area, and it's a very important area for tourism. So it was a great opportunity to look at how we might do something differently. And they were some of the ingredients. Also, we had some key sort of players down on the Dingle Peninsula who were very supportive in kind of mobilizing the project to get it off the ground. So
well, that's what I was wondering, because when you said at the very beginning that you know the community wanted to explore this idea of getting to a low carbon society, how did you even discover that this community wanted to do this?
And well, there's an initiative down there called the Dingle Hub, which focuses on essentially trying to look at opportunities for retaining employment opportunities, high-paying, sustainable jobs in the area. And one of the focus areas of their activity was looking at sustainability. And one of the key players involved, who's on the advisory committee for the Dingle Hub, is also a chair of the governance committee of MaREI. So there was a wonderful connection opportunity there to help bring us on board at a very early stage in the project.
You mentioned then this idea of the electrification of heat transport, and you talk about things like heat pumps and just moving across to electricity essentially. But it's one thing to have this goal of doing something. It sounds fantastic, in theory, but it's another in practice. And when you even think about electricity, not all electricity is produced by renewables. Some electricity comes from fossil fuels. So you're talking about kind of like a very complicated project. Is that fair to say?
Yes, in many ways, the technology is the easy part in this. What we're talking about with electrification of heat and transport is decisions that families and businesses make. And any change can be disruptive. So it was very important to understand not only the challenges from the technology side, but the societal challenges in this transition to a low carbon future. And this is one of the reasons that um, the project identified the usefulness and the need to identify ambassadors, so people in the community who were willing to work with these new technologies, and also to speak about their experiences, good and bad, with these technologies, as a way of trying to see how we could, I suppose, draw on the experience of individuals to increase the adoption of these new technologies. And and that's been a key part of the project in terms of, from the outset, that focus on the experience of individuals, homeowners, businesses, farms, on using these technologies, sharing those experiences to, I suppose, demystify in many ways the uses of the technology, and also to give some clarity on the experience and what it was really like, if you like, to change and to adapt to what these new technologies might mean in their homes, in their businesses, and on their farms.
Well, it feels like the perfect time to bring in Claire into this, because Claire, your work focuses on community engagement, which is precisely what Brian was talking about there. How do you go about having a goal of doing one thing, but actually getting buy-in from various different stakeholders when it comes to something like climate change?
Mhm. I mean, I think one big thing that we've learned along the way is that you need to work with people from where they're at rather than from where we want them to be. So it's really important not to rock on into a community and said, we're going to educate and train you to do what you need to do. So our key thing, I think, on the peninsula was to involve people as much as possible in the different projects, so that in a sense they could learn by doing. So it wasn't an instructive process. It was a process where people could evolve and they could gain empowerment and they could build up capacity. Because I think that is a very important area for people, because I think, to be honest, a
Don't
lot of
just
us feel,
parachute in, then you don't just parachute in and
yeah,
say, right, you're doing it all wrong, because
yeah,
that's
yeah.
not what we want to be told, is it?
I mean, the point of engaged research is that you don't do that, that you actually work with the group that you're working with. So myself and Connor and Evan, two PhD students, have been down on the peninsula really for the last 4 years. And I think we've learned a lot ourselves. So it wasn't just that we went in to do the research. We were very involved in helping to organize the activities and helping to develop, as you say, the engagement approach. And then we've kind of created this process of reflective learning, because it's very important that, particularly when you're organizing something locally and you're involving so many different people, we need to learn from the experience. So rather than actually saying, yeah, we'll do this, we'll do that, what we've done is reflected on each step that we've taken with the various projects and tried to learn, if we're making mistakes, what are the mistakes and can we rectify them next time around? And then what are the benefits? And most importantly, we're looking at, what impact are we having when we do these various activities? Now, I know that is a very long-term kind of hope that you will actually establish what the impact is, but we're trying to identify that we meet our aims and that we don't actually waste time and waste community people in the community, because in fairness, there's been a great response locally, particularly amongst the farming community. So we're working with the farmers on a number of different projects to do with sensor technology, and we're working with an artist looking at diversification options for 10 farm families. And I
When you say
think,
that, what does that mean? Does that mean like
yeah,
changing how they work on the farm, or changing
yeah, I mean,
what they
we've
produce?
been working on this project for a year, since December, and it's finishing this December. And it's a very interesting journey, both for us in the team as well as the farmers. Because I suppose the team, we came in with our own kind of preconceived notions to some extent of what needs to happen in relation to agriculture and emissions, you know. But working with the farmers, it's been really instructive for both sides. So we've been going on what we're calling familiarization trips, essentially site visits to various places around the country that would be, you know, farms that are trying new things. And we visited an anaerobic digester. We went up to the Burren, where they're working very creatively with a group of farmers. So we've tried to open up the experiences of the farmers to new actions that are happening elsewhere. And we're also building relationships with each other. And it's very interesting to watch how gradually the farmers are beginning to open up to new ideas, you know, and they're looking now at their own farms and saying, maybe, you know, I could plant a bit of forestry, or how about a little bit of an eco-tourist option, or, you know, ways of diversifying away from maybe intensification.
So when you say intensification, do you mean things like beef farming, for example, like
Now, I
livestock?
mean, in fairness, on the peninsula, we're not really talking about big intensified dairy farms. So and that probably is one of the gripes of the local farmers, is that they feel that they're being blamed and shamed along with the big farmers in the Midlands or wherever. They're very interested, I think, in keeping things relatively small if they can, but they do need to make a living, you know. So there's great hope, I think, for the smaller farms, that they will shift towards, I mean, a couple of our farmers are now talking about going organic. There's a shift towards more regenerative farming, you know, where you're doing various different things. It's not just one type of farming. So I think it's really important that we hear the views and the opinions of these smaller farmers, you know, because sometimes we just hear about the bigger ones.
And you know, it's hard to talk about something like farming without it quickly descending into kind of almost like a toxic conversation, because what I've come to understand as someone who comes from a farming background, albeit a small farmer in the Midlands, is that it's a very emotional issue. It's an economic one and it's an environmental one, but there's an emotional attachment to the land and to the kind of the legacy or the heritage that particular families have had in Ireland for not just decades, but often hundreds of years, where the farm may have been handed down from one generation to the other. So, as you said there, at the start, Claire, meeting people where they're at and
Mm.
trying to figure out, you know, navigate change in maybe more constructive and positive ways, as
And
it's
I
very easy
think,
to vilify or create homogenous groups as well.
yeah, and I think you can alienate people, you know, if they feel blamed and shamed, they can say, well, why bother? You know, whereas the farming community, they really want to be respected, because in a sense, they're doing a really important job. They're providing our food, you know, so they're incredibly essential to the well-being of any society. But they feel, I mean, I heard a farmer the other day, he said he feels demonized. And he does say that it's coming through the media in terms of the kind of stories that are out there, and they really want their stories to be heard. So I mean, we're hoping with this creative project that we would be able to do that a bit, you know, in the coming months.
You've kind of touched on something that I think climate change in general, or even the idea of carbon neutral or carbon positive living, um, brings up, is that it can become quite a polarizing a subject, almost like a political subject for people. And so, like, let's talk about, Brian, if you wouldn't mind me asking you a little bit more detail on how climate change and even, you know, the transition to more sustainable living can quickly become a polarizing issue. So how do you begin to navigate something like that? Can we just talk in practical terms about the Dingle Peninsula 2030 project, the kind of overview of the different projects that are being worked on? What do you focus on first when you've got something as big as climate change to think about?
Well, exactly to your point, I suppose what we tried to do was break it down into individual things that can be delivered on initially to start, so people can see how different things can evolve and how change can take place. So I mentioned the ambassadors program, which was a very important element of the project, where we asked people, we set up a competition, in fact, for people to come forward who would become ambassadors, who would try out technologies over a period, and then talk to their neighbours and be willing to talk to the media and to others about their experiences. And one of the things we learned from that, which was kind of what we expected, that if people saw these technologies and heard from neighbors and friends about them, that it would demystify them and increase the uptake of these technologies. So we that was something we observed in terms of an increase in the amount of solar panels coming onto the peninsula relative to the installation rates elsewhere in the country. And
Is
so
that just
so
because
that
they
was a
saw someone else who did it, who could then share their learnings and say, "Well, I did this, and this is how it worked out for me," and it kind of
exactly.
takes away some of the friction, and it's also like peer to peer, making it more about, you know, the community as opposed to either a person who's selling the product or someone from, you know, an economic or political group.
Exactly. So it's a neighbor and somebody they know and somebody they trust, and so it sets up a different dynamic. And in many ways, we anticipated seeing some of that dynamic, and so it was encouraging to see the results from that. What we didn't anticipate, what we were really blown away by, was the much wider energy it seemed to unleash in the community, in the sense that the the amount of activities and discussions that we hadn't anticipated that have really kind of flourished, if you like. So one was farmers coming together to talk about aspects of sustainability and wanting to see what they could do. Um, Another was these ambassadors. They were getting asked questions from their friends and neighbors. And then they realized that some of the questions they were having difficulty answering. So they went to the local education and training board and said, you know, hey, can you set up a course in energy mentorship, you know? And and then discussions about transportation happened on the peninsula, and engagement with the local link public transport service to see how the buses might be transferred over to electric buses. So we started to see this much wider phenomenon, which we started to call the diffusion of sustainability, where um, because of the initiation of the projects and the support that we were able to make available to the community, the response and the enthusiasm was just excellent. And we saw a building of societal capacity in the area. So one example of that is one of the ambassadors, who's a farmer who tried out the technologies. He then got together with a number of other farmers on the peninsula, and they collectively established the West Kerry Dairy Farmers Sustainable Energy Community. And that was something we wouldn't have anticipated at the start. That based on the experience, we see these knock-on effects, and as I say, a building of capacity and ambition and activity, and that's been hugely wonderful to see. And to your earlier point, it's the total antithesis, if you like, of the toxic dialogue that can sometimes take place, or the polarization in some of these discussions. Because what we found there was, and I'd say this is generally the case, that people want to be able to do the right thing. They want to. They are concerned. We're all concerned about the future in
Mm.
different ways and different dimensions. So if there are things that we can do, if the resources are made available, if the barriers are removed, it can build a sense of collective activity and collective focus towards something positive and something sustainable. So it's been hugely rewarding as a kind of researcher, being able to support a process like that and observe what's really what's materialized. It's been brilliant.
It must feel fantastic to have been part of something like that. And as you say, the topic of climate change or sustainability can be very polarizing, and it's very easy to sometimes rush quickly to judgment or to other people. Let's say someone's driving like a massive SUV, to, you know, make a value judgment then about that person and what do these things signify, or if you're a meat eater, or, you know, there are various things now that it can be very easy to latch on to then just take a one-dimensional viewpoint of somebody. But as you say, a lot, you know, most people, if you give them the benefit of the doubt, we want to live a good life and want the best for our families, for ourselves, and for the planet. Can we talk about, like, this project has been a massive success, would you say? Is that fair to say this has been a big success?
I mean, I think, in fairness, we probably would say that it's done very well, but there have been challenges, and there's a lot of more work to be done. Once you start working in this space, you realize how much more work needs to happen. So I think we're reluctant to take on too much of the sense that, we've cracked it or we've really achieved everything. There's a lot more work to be done on the peninsula.
So while there have been some successes and lots of learnings, this isn't like something we can just then replicate everywhere else.
No, and I think even on the peninsula, there's so much groundwork done now, and the important thing is now to build on that, which I suppose brings us to the thorny issue of resources, because that would have been one of the challenges that we have faced, is because all the work that we've been outlining there needs to be coordinated. There needs to be some level of coordination and management, and that doesn't come from volunteers, because the task is too all-encompassing. So, and there's a lot of skill. I mean, you asked earlier about engagement and involving people. There are certain skills required in that, so what we're always saying is that there needs to be some long-term continuous funding stream for projects like this. Otherwise they can't meet their potential. I mean, unfortunately, the funding at the moment is quite sporadic. It's piecemeal. So there's an odd funding call that comes out. Now, in fairness, we've had great support from Science Foundation Ireland. We have to acknowledge that. We've had 2 of their Discover awards, and they've been very, very useful. They've helped us kind of to work on engaging locally and learning from the practices down there. So that's been very valuable. But the other funding calls are few and far between, to be honest. And when they do come, they're very short-lived. So you might find that someone has a part-time job on this piece of a project, or 1 day a week on the other. And it doesn't make it easy to employ kind of good people. We have a great team, in fairness, working on the peninsula, but it is very hard for people to apply for these kind of jobs if there isn't some sort of remuneration and long-term aspect to them.
Yeah, and money talks, and we're living in an age where inflation is hitting very high levels now, and there's a cost of living crisis and an energy crisis. And while the energy crisis itself, it almost in a way reinforces the need for projects like these. It has this kind of like double-edged sword with it, where people are just trying to get by now, rather than like even thinking too far ahead to 2030 or 2050, when these climate targets are aiming towards, net zero, etc. So it's like kind of trying to balance what can we do in the now, and then how can we plan ahead for the future. Listen, we're going to talk a bit more about this project, but let's just pause for a short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Science Week podcast with me, Anne-Marie Tomchak. Today we're talking about the award-winning Dingle Peninsula 2030 project, and I'm here with Brian and Claire. We were talking about some of the challenges, Brian and Claire, with regard to even doing a project like this, but more widely, some of the challenges around climate change and sustainability. Brian, can we talk a bit more about that? Because a problem of the magnitude of climate change can be hard to get your head around, and it can be very polarizing. What is needed for real change to happen?
I think there's a number of key elements. I mean, we've been doing this engaged research now for probably about 10 years in the climate space. And in the early stages, what was really missing nationally was any kind of political leadership on this topic. And we were working with energy communities who were struggling to develop energy efficiency or renewable energy initiatives in their area. And a thing that really struck them was that they were struggling away at this, but they weren't hearing any voices in government in support of what they were doing. And that change that we've seen over the last number of years has been transformational. So that's a very positive step in the sense that we legislated last year for very ambitious emissions reduction targets. And that's really the government showing leadership in terms of developing that ambition. Now, translating that ambition into action is very challenging, and it cuts across everyone. Part of the reason where it becomes polarized is that individuals, be it farmers, be it citizens, feel that they're to blame through the things that they do. And so there are challenges that individuals will have to look at in terms of understand their role in this. But really, the real problem is systemic. I mean, you can't have a situation where you're demanding change. Say, for example, I mean, we need to reduce the number of fossil fuel cars. That's very clear from the in terms of the emissions that are generated. But we need to have in place alternatives for people in order. I mean, people still will need to be able to get around. Need to be able to move around. So
So whether that's
whether
better
that's
public transport infrastructure or more electric vehicles or carpooling, like there's lots of
yeah,
different ways you could think about that.
exactly, and walking and cycling, infrastructure to be able to safely do these things so that we can have active modes and more public transport and really change how we do transport, if you like, um, and so and that just gives one example. But I mean, it's not just. I mean, so part of it is about individual choice, certainly, but it's really putting systems in place and getting a systemic change. And this is the interesting thing again, like looking down on what's happening on the peninsula, because we do have individuals who are making changes in their own life, but they're also coming together collectively, and they're engaging with the public transport bodies, they're engaging with the local authority. So they're making requests and demands to not only so that they are living more sustainably, but so that everyone can.
This is one of the things actually about sustainability that I suppose doesn't always come across. But once you start trying to, let's say, as an individual or consumer, make changes, you realize just how omnipresent fossil fuels are. If you even just look at the four walls around you and the materials that are being used, you're going to see plastic pretty quickly and lots of other materials which are derivatives of fossil fuels. So trying to make these changes can be difficult. But on the flip side, the positive side is once you start engaging with sustainability, let's say even in terms of how you buy clothes, and if you are uh, wanting to buy if you start, for example, shopping pre-loved fashion, one of the things I have experienced personally from taking a more circular point of view to how I shop for my wardrobe would be you get to know other people in the community. Or I would rent out my wardrobe, for example, and then you have these lovely personal exchanges with another person who you've lent your dress to for a night out. Now look, we're going far away from the Dingle Peninsula right now. We're talking about renting my wardrobe, but what I'm trying to say is it's about that human connection as well. That the emotion and the human connection of these kinds of acts or activities that shape your values and the way you live. That's kind of a motivator then. It gives you that dopamine hit that you otherwise would get maybe from buying fast fashion. So there's kind of ways of replacing. It's about replacing our behaviors with other things, but as you say, systemic change is needed, and policy and regulation is also needed. It's far more complicated than me as an individual or you as an individual just wanting to do better. We need to also live in a world where the systems are kind of set up for us to realistically do that.
And just to say, we're bombarded with messages, sending us in the opposite direction, and this is one of the key challenges. The shiny new car, the shiny new clothes. It's a There's a whole um, system focused on single use, on consumption, on more and more, and it really is. This is part of where the systemic issue lies, in terms of that the problems that it's generated, and equally then the options to do something different. I mean, if you don't want to have a concrete based home, where do you look, where do you start? Is there opportunities to do that? So um as you say, we're so centered in a fossil fuel based world that it's difficult. So one step is, as individuals, to consciously try and engage with that and do something different. But the systems have to be changed to actually enable that change to happen. So to make that those decisions easier to implement or possible to implement even.
And to incentivize them as well, so that there isn't more friction when you're actually just trying to do the right thing.
Correct.
That it actually is made easier for people. And Claire, I want to bring you in because you've been doing lots of work in the community engagement side. How do we engage communities? How do we replicate that more broadly? There are lots of challenges to navigate, aren't there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is that we need to go in with an open mind, so in the past, I was in the environmental sector. So we were very good at just going in and telling people what to do, the 10 things you can do approach. But I think, as Brian was saying, we really need to do it collectively, and there is so much power in, as you say, peer pressure and in social norms, so if we can somehow change the norm. So in your case, you're now looking at alternatives to fast fashion, so the norm of how you shop will be changing with the other people you're doing it with. So we are in a much better space, I think, than we would have been 10, 15 years ago, in that people they're certainly waking up to the reality that we do have to change. It is a challenge because we're really looking at lifestyle change, so we live a very consumer driven lifestyle that is really driven by fossil fuels. So it's really looking at every aspect of our lives, but no one wants to be an early adopter. So, 10, 15 years ago, the people who were making these changes really were quite isolated. And, some people felt they were cranks, whereas now there is a lot more social support for people who want to change, which is a really good thing. But there is a need
become
for,
more
I think,
mainstream, isn't it?
It has, yeah. And I mean, you're hearing about it now. I mean, before you wouldn't hear about it in the media. There's a lot more focus on the importance of change and what people can do. Now, I think that the challenge still is that while people may know they want to change, it's actually making that step to change. And that's where the coordination piece comes in. If there is an initiative like Dingle Peninsula 2030 and the Dingle Hub and NewKid who are involved, ESB networks, if there's organisations like that actually coming in and helping to kickstart initiatives, that's really important.
So the big and the small things really kind of need to come together, don't they?
Yeah, and there's something about trying to normalise it. In the past, it was seen as a very environmental thing to be working in climate action, and we have to help people to see that it's across the board, so that you can't pigeonhole it. And you definitely, I mean, we were talking about polarization there earlier on. You definitely can't set up one group against the other. So on the Dingle Peninsula, when we were looking at how we would develop a transport or an active travel sustainable mobility project, we were very keen to include all modes of travel. So what you don't want to do is pit the walkers against the cyclists and the cyclists against the cars. So you actually
when you're a cyclist, you can't stand the motorists, and when you're a motorist, you can't stand the cyclists. That being on both sides of the coin.
And you just get stuck if you end up firing dirt at each other. You really have to be working collectively and saying, okay, this is our area. How can we fit in all the modes of transport and meet people's different needs? So that's really important.
We're going to finish with some rapid fire questions, and a lot of people have been asking these questions online. So here we go. What's the biggest obstacle that stops people wanting to engage with this kind of change?
I would say fear. I think there's an element of fear of change, fear of the future. If I address anything to do with climate change, I have to maybe face that it's happening.
It seems hard.
Fear.
Yes, people are afraid. Okay. Is there a human behavioural difference to this depending on where you live, whether you're in a rural or an urban area?
I think the response required might be different because the context is different and the needs are different. I'm not convinced that there's a human behavioural difference as such. And this would be from working with other communities who are in urban areas. We can see some of the same barriers, but also some of the same sort of willingness to change.
Is Ireland's farmland better than other EU countries? And should our agricultural targets differ because of that?
That's a very interesting one. Our emissions
These aren't really rapid fire questions, are they?
Yeah. That's a deep one.
Maybe give that one again.
Do you want me to read it out again, or do you need to have more time? Is there any one thing other countries have implemented that we've been slow to take up in Ireland?
I mean, I
Anaerobic
think
digestion.
Claire?
I was going to say community energy. So countries like Denmark and Scotland, they're way ahead of us in terms of communities accessing, 100% community-owned renewable energy.
Oh, interesting. So would this be like if you have like a solar panel scheme on houses, and when then they
Yeah.
share the energy that's the supplement energy that's on the grid or something, or
I
how does that
mean,
work?
we have one community-owned energy farm in Templederry in County Tipperary. And there are a lot of groups now who are applying into the Renewable Energy Support Scheme, trying to get their projects up and running. But there are fundamental barriers, and one of them is accessing the grid. The cost it would cost for the groups to actually access the grid. So that is a fundamental problem. But I mean, the regulatory support has improved over the last few years, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Brian, anything that comes to mind for you?
Um, well, anaerobic digestion, I think we've done very well on the renewable energy side. We've done very well on renewable electricity. So with our tremendous wind resource, but the area of renewable transport and renewable heat is an area we're lacking, and anaerobic digestion to develop biogas is something. And again, to Claire's point, there's other countries that are taking a lead on this. So it's something we could and should adopt more quickly.
Watch and learn and
But can
implement.
I just say where we are leading in Ireland is in citizens' assemblies. So we had a very good citizens' assembly on climate change a number of years ago. So I think we're good at dialogue and deliberation.
When you say citizens' assembly, what does that mean?
Oh, well, I mean, it's bringing people representing the community together. So we had one on abortion, and we had one on gay marriage. So it's about bringing, I think it's about 96 people together to deliberate on the issues, the pros and the cons of a certain issues. So when they came together to talk about climate change, they were looking at all the different kinds of solutions and what government could do, and obviously the different problems. So it was about spending time with representatives really of the whole community, trying to grapple with the issue at hand and then trying to recommend solutions. And in fairness, there were about 13 solutions recommended, and they did feed into a joint Oireachtas report, which to some extent fed into the climate action plan, so there was a place for the recommendations to go. They were heard.
Well, we could keep asking more of these questions all day, and maybe some of them take a bit more time than a rapid fire answer, but we have to stop somewhere. Thank you very much for giving us your time today, Clare Watson and Professor Brian Ó Gallachóir. I'm Anne-Marie Tomchak. Thank you so much for listening to the Science Week podcast and to watching us. Don't forget, you can check out scienceweek.ie for a full rundown of all that's happening in person and virtually all week.